I think the acknowledgement this week, particularly as we're in National Reconciliation Week, is an important thing for us to do. So AAANZ acknowledges and pays respect to the past, present, and future traditional custodians and elders of this nation, and the continuation of cultural, spiritual, and educational practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We had the privilege Wednesday night to take the students to a film called Smoke Between the Trees, which is a story about Aboriginal reconciliation. And it was a movie that was filmed in the Blue Mountains. I highly recommend it if you get a chance to see it. After the film, we had a Q&A with 3 of the actors and one of the producers of the movie. But it was an excellent Reconciliation Week event. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this book, Eco Bible. This is Volume 1, an ecological commentary on Genesis and Exodus. It's a book that I discovered recently, written by a couple of rabbis. They say in the introduction, what does the Bible say about ecology? As people face huge ecological challenges, including growing hurricanes, floods, forest fires, and plastic pollution, the groundbreaking Eco Bible dives into this question. Drawing on 3,500 years of religious ethics, it shows how the Bible itself and its great scholars embrace care for God's creation as a fundamental and living message. The Eco Bible quotes over 100 rabbis from biblical times to the present. Until now, their ecological insights on the Bible could only be found scattered across hundreds of books. But what these 2 rabbis did was gathered up all of these comments and put them into one volume. Applying biblical ethics to stewardship, conservation, and creation care is not just an idea for today, but is essential for a future where we live in balance and thrive on a planet that remains viable for all of life. And I just want to read part of their introduction. And this image just fascinated me. They have a section called Drilling on Ships. They say, according to an 1,800-year-old Jewish commentary on the Hebrew Bible, this rabbi describes a group of people traveling in a boat. One of them takes a drill and begins to bore a hole. The others ask, what are you doing? And this person replies, well, why are you concerned? Am I not drilling under my own place? The rest reply, but you will flood the boat for all of us. Imagine being a passenger on this boat. One person, without concern for others, jeopardizes your safety and security. The person drilling may have compelling reasons. Perhaps they are hungry and want to drop a fishing line, or hot and want to cool their feet in the water. Maybe the boat is on fresh water and they are thirsty. But no matter how compelling the reason, drilling a hole in a boat to fulfill one's person's desires threatens everyone. Rabbi Shimon's story warns us of the destructive power of letting our selfish desires overtake all other considerations. Today's environmental challenges are not about whatever floats your boat. Everyone on the boat or planet needs to work together to ensure such behavior doesn't continue. The person drilling is dangerous, but the rest of us ignoring the threat they pose is equally dangerous. If the boat sinks, the fault is both the drillers and those who stood idly by. And then they go on and they talk about the earth being our collective ship. And they talk about Noah's Ark and then the Titanic. And they end this section by saying our current reality has striking similarities to the Titanic, whose captain received many warnings of icebergs from other ships, but chose to ignore them. He believed that his ship, the largest ever built, was stronger than nature. It was unsinkable. By the time the crew spotted the fatal iceberg, it was too late to turn the ship away from its cataclysmic collision course. Today, we are on an ecological collision course of our own making and are bearing full steam ahead. But there is still time to act like Noah instead of the Titanic's captain. Our ship carries all of humanity and all species. By uniting and striving to live in balance with creation and with God's help, we can steer toward a future that ensures the survival and thriving of everyone and everything on board. Today, our guests are John and Sue McKinnon, and this was the introduction that was in the mailing, talking about Sue and John being leaders at Engadine Uniting Church, being philanthropists, using investments to challenge climate change issues and working with climate change activists. Both of them have been former members on the executive committee of AAA&Z, and you can see that some of their background. This was in the mailing. So what we're going to do at this point is turn it over to John and Sue and hear from them a little bit about how we go about saving this ship from sinking. So John and Sue, welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Mark.
We'll sort of take turns at this, but I'll kick off. It's nice to, after being immersed in politics for some time, it's nice to take a change of direction and place these sorts of discussions in a different context. Being part of the Uniting Church, we followed the lectionary, and I just happened to be rostered on to preach the day after the election, and the lectionary included a reading from Revelation 20 and 21. And I had to write my sermon before I knew the election result. I'm not one of these people that can do a last-minute job. So I found that a bit of a challenge, but I just want to share a few thoughts from that now, because I think this is quite relevant. In fact, I think the book of Revelation is very relevant to the situation we find ourselves in now. So we have, the Christians at the time was written, dominated by empire. And we've probably heard a lot about empire before, how empire constrains imaginations, how the oppressor becomes the savior, the protector, the provider. So while the Roman Empire was the persecutor, the oppressor, the occupier, was also, we had the Pax Romana, the provider, the protector. And we get this almost Stockholm syndrome type situation where we rely on our oppressor. And one thing that the oppressor does is it captures the imagination, prevents us seeing a different future. And I think that's what we can relate to the situation we have in the world, in Australia now. Empires might look different, but we are still subject to empires, ideologies that constrain our imaginations and stop us seeing a different future. So, for example, we're told we can't fix climate change. It's impossible. It would cost too much money. It would ruin our economies. We would not have enough power. People in the third world would starve. All those reasons why we can't do it. Our imaginations are limited. And we're told we can't do a lot of things by these powerful sort of empire-like forces around us. And what the book of Revelation does, it unmasks that situation, hence the name. It unmasks that Rome is really an evil force of domination. And it sets the imagination free. And we get to chapters 20 and 21, and we see a different future imagined. We see heaven coming down to earth. We see the new Jerusalem coming down to earth. And the author describes in his vision this city with streets paved with gold and a river flowing through that everyone can access, and a tree whose leaves are for the healing of the nations, and where it fruits all year round, so everyone can eat all year round. And that was the author's vision of a different future to what the Roman Empire was offering. And I think what it does is invite us to imagine a different future. And we might not imagine cities paved with gold streets, but we might imagine a future where the climate is safe and no longer heating up. We might imagine a future that is not based on carbon-intensive industries. We might imagine a future with good aged care, a whole lot of things, right? But I think the book of Revelation invites us to be free from the constraints that have been placed on our imaginations and to imagine something that is new and healthy, a different future. and that we can participate in bringing about. And that's what today we want to share with you. So it's 4 examples of organisations, movements, things that are happening that are working towards this different future where people have broken out of the constraints on their imaginations and are imagining something different, achieving something new. So that's where we want to go today. And Sue is going to kick off with
okay, thank you very much. Yep. So first one's a very recent and relevant example, and that's the rise and success of the community independence that we saw in the last election, but also let's not forget in 2019 in the seat of Warringah, and before that in the seat of Indi. An impossible vision. For anyone who knows Australian politics, the power of the incumbents, the two-party system in Australia, and people have known for decades, it can't be broken. It's just not how it works here. An absolutely impossible vision of people dreaming about something different in a rural area and then managing to do it in 2013 and again in 2016. And then the, rash idea, could we do that in a city area? No way, it's different in rural areas. And the good folk of Warringah were planning for a couple of election cycles ahead, and then circumstances changed and their imagination went, no, we're going to give this a go, and we did it. And now in 2022, but of course it's starting back in 2019 and 2020, people looking at our democracy and realising it's actually a very fragile thing. And we're seeing that with Western democracies around the world, that it's not this linear improvement all the time in things like democracy, women's rights. We're going around in circles that we'd rather not be. And it's possible to go backwards with the rise of, all sorts of oppressive power and pushing down on civil society. So there's been many column inches written about the community independence and how it happened. A couple of observations. Australia's most senior and Canberra-embedded political journalists did not see this coming and did not understand it. And some of them still do not understand what happened. But anyone who spent time in those communities can see what's happened and understand what's happened. And the things that are part of that, which I think people in AANZ would recognise, are incredible levels of collaboration, geographically, just so much. People being so generous in sharing their knowledge, people giving generously of hundreds of hours of their time from Indi and Warringah to share what they knew with other people. People being embedded in communities to come and learn from them, people opening their homes to have people from other cities come and stay with them and see what we're doing, and people going to teach other people what to do. Incredible levels of trust, people placing in strangers that they've only just met, but united with a shared value, a shared vision, a shared imagination and dream. Some people taking massive risks to their wallet, risks to their social and economic reputation, their community standing, their business prospects for their own business, people being really willing to step out and do something bigger and more enormous than they've done before, with big reputations, and willing to risk those in standing up and saying, yeah, I'm on board with this thing and I know I'm going to get, pilloried and abused, and I'm up for that because this is the only way I can see, this is the best way I can see I can contribute to that. Educating voters, sharing the vision and dream. I think that story of if Australia's senior political commentators couldn't get what was going on and couldn't see what was being asked, what hope do people on the street have? They're not getting it through the papers. And it's a little bit complicated at times. People had to work out ways to effectively share their vision and their dream. How do you share that with somebody else? How do you tell somebody, this is what I'm dreaming, this is what can be real, and this is how you can help? And we wouldn't have seen thousands of people turning out to volunteer if the people with the vision, the dream, the new imagination weren't able to effectively share that with others at a level of detail and with a passion, with a compelling story that made people go, I've never done anything like this in my life before, but I'm jumping on board. It's just amazing. And there's thousands of stories around that. So what the impact could be, much of the electoral appeal of independence is that they're not part of Australia's political duopoly, and they want to change the tempo and the tone of democratic deliberation in Australia. For the very first time, we've got more than half the people in the Australian Parliament who at least say they want to do something serious about climate change. They've never had that before. They're also supposedly committed to tackling corruption at a federal level and doing something about the treatment of women in federal parliament and beyond. We've never had this before. Will we be disappointed? Yep, absolutely. But are we better off than what we were before? Even more so, undoubtedly, we're better off. So this is an impossible dream that, you know, is now a reality. I think we often get so acculturated to thinking that big things are too difficult, big things are impossible, they're too expensive, they take too long. People won't change the way that they do things. People won't change that quickly. I think they will. I think they're just waiting for a compelling story and something to step out and commit themselves to make positive change. Hand back to you, John.
Thank you, Sue. I can't stress enough how 6 new independents in the House of Representatives, a new independent senator, is extraordinary. That would have been laughed at 3 years ago. It really is extraordinary. And it's what you can do, just as Sue said. I want to talk about something, Mark mentioned he'd read the book, The Big Switch. And that's what I just want to mention now. So an engineer called Saul Griffiths, who has been in the States, he advised the Biden administration on switching to electricity. There it is, there's the book. So I haven't read the book actually, but I have heard Saul talk a number of times and I've met him. His very basic idea is that we can fix a large part of the climate change issue by switching everything to electricity. And this is the key bit, this is what blows imaginations, we will actually save money by doing so. And I think in his book, he estimates that the average Australian household would save $5,000 a year if we switch to everything to renewable electricity. That is, away from gas, away from fossil electricity, away from petrol in your car. And that is what is the outside the realm of what was considered possible. The debate for the last 9 years in Australia has been, yes, we'd like to do something on climate change if we believe it exists, but assuming we do, we want to do something about it, but it would cost too much. It would kill jobs. It would kill the economy. And what Saul has done is says, no, it's actually going to create lots of jobs and it's going to make you all $5,000 a year richer. And again, he's going outside the boundaries of what was considered possible to say that. And not only did he not get laughed at, he's written a book, he's talking to senior politicians federally and state, you know, part of the Biden team over in the States. And it shows what you can do when you're prepared to think outside what politicians call the Overton window, what I call before sort of the limits of our imagination, and make an outrageous claim, and he backed it up with research and evidence. And you can take that further and say, even this last week, we've seen the arguments over why electricity prices are so high. If we did what Saul said, it wouldn't be an issue at all. And those of you in Canberra know this isn't an issue because you're using 100% renewables. But for those of us in other states, suddenly we're realising the cost of doing nothing for 10 years on coal and gas power. The reason it's so expensive in these other states is because we didn't do what he said. And again, that would be heresy to the empire, those in power. But Saul's absolutely right. We can do this, we can make money, we can make jobs in the process. So I think it's just another example. There's so many parts to it. I mean, read his book, there's so many parts of this. It's about your household, what you cook with, what you drive. It's all those things together. So many different bits to it. But when you put it together, it's a paradigm shift that will become reality and probably a lot quicker than what we think. Third thing I want to mention, and if you don't read the business pages, you might have missed this during the week, but AGL, the big Australia's biggest carbon emitter, owns brown coal power station in Victoria and 2 black coal power stations in New South Wales. Had proposed to split itself into 2, and what was behind that, they were going to keep running their coal power stations for another 20 or more years, right through into the 2040s. Absolute disaster from a climate perspective, but that's what they were going to do, and it was pretty much a fait accompli. The vote was going to be in June. a number of organisations, and the most prominent was McKinnon Brooks at Grok Ventures, founder of Atlassian, but others as well that we have some involvement with, basically took them on. Now, Mike actually having enough money to buy a decent chunk of the company helps, but that wasn't the only part of it. And as a result of what he did, what the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility did, harnessing other institutional shareholders, what Greenpeace did, harnessing retail shareholders and other groups, what the election achieved, basically creating a new context this was operating in, meant that on Monday, AGL caved in. Half their board has quit. They're no longer going to do that. And my bet is that all of those power stations will be closed before 2030. And again, it shows how quickly things can happen when people like Mike have a big vision and are prepared to put their money where their mouth is. You know, he's got lots of money to put where his mouth is, and none of us have quite as much. But another organisation I mentioned, ACCR, they engage with corporates, use shareholder activism to bring about change, to put a resolution at a company AGM need 100 shareholders. And any one of those shareholders can be one of you or me. One share is enough. You don't need to be rich. So we don't need to be McKinnon Brooks with billions of dollars to do this. We can be quite small. And ACCR played as big a role as Mike did in bringing about that change. So that's another place where the unthinkable suddenly becomes reality. You know, a big corporate behemoth, government-backed, doing what they will, suddenly there's a shift because people get an idea that this can change, they're prepared to act on it, and you get a shift that takes you outside what was previously thought imaginable. Back to you, Sue.
Okay, thank you very much. For our fourth and final example, I want to talk about a project called Voices for Power. It's under Sydney Alliance. You may not have heard of that. But I want to seize on that word power. And I think as part of the church, we're often uncomfortable with the notion of taking power ourselves. We know that Christians are meant to, be very submissive and meek and that sort of thing, and power grabbing is for empires and so forth. The Sydney Alliance is a very diverse coalition of community organisations, religious organisations, unions and schools that organise together as a community to build power for people who normally don't have any at all, for people who, just ordinary people for whom local government, state government, federal government make decisions all the time that aren't in their interests, whether it's about building a toxic waste incinerator right next door to them, to not doing anything about energy prices, so everybody's dying of the heat in summer and freezing to death in winter, and just, a million things. Public transport, terrible decisions there. And people affected by these just don't have any power at all. What happens when they get together, not just as individuals, but if they can get a whole lot of their different community groups, as I said, unions, churches, neighbourhood centres, and that sort of thing, and each of them with their title, we represent this many people in the community, we could get together and actually build power with the decision makers to make Sydney a more just, fair and sustainable city. So one of the projects of Sydney Alliance is Voices for Power, which brings diverse cultural, religious and community leaders together to build that power I just referenced, to organise for clean and affordable energy solutions for communities in Western Sydney. And we've been able to support this in helping them train volunteer leaders, pay for community organisers and so forth, and growing and developing people in communities to develop as leaders and work together, respecting the contribution and dignity of all people. So in Western Sydney, we all know we've got Matt here today. There's often poor infrastructure for transport and things like that. It's very hot. It's getting hotter every summer. Renters have very little to no rights in this country. And so there's organising going on amongst communities, organisations representing communities. In particular, so we have many communities in Western Sydney who are fellow believers along with us. We have the Pacific diaspora. We have Arabic Christians from Lebanon and Egypt. We have Christians from Malaysia and the Philippines. But there's also other people of religious backgrounds as well, Arabic and Asian Muslims and Jewish networks, as well as people with little or no religious background. Increasingly in Australia, we are being, well, okay, perhaps not increasingly, we ought to be, we're certainly here in the Uniting Church, hearing from our Pacific brothers and sisters whose homelands are at greatest risk in climate change and going underwater and things like that. It's an issue of national security as well. In the lead up to the federal election, there was a big event held at Penrith Panthers, asking people to come from the seats of Lindsay and, was it Fowler or Macquarie? Anyway, hopefully someone was there. And Sydney Alliance have a very, very, very structured, well-developed way of approaching people in power, which they've learnt from much older organisations in the UK and the US around building power of communities, about getting everybody together, represent their communities, bringing the decision makers in, using all sorts of techniques to persuade them to show up, and all sorts of techniques to demonstrate the power of the community, that these people are voters and that they won't be so easily divided or pitted against one another using old political tricks from seasoned politicians. But they've become very good at nailing politicians down, getting them to commit to particular things that they didn't want to, or they wanted to shrug off, and making commitments to their communities. And the communities have built the power to follow up on those. How can we engage with that? This is really something all of us can learn from, even if you don't live in Sydney and can do anything about the Sydney Alliance. It's actually quite possible to start building those sorts of networks in your own communities, reaching out amongst your networks and helping work together, encouraging groups who can participate in a network to join together and work for the common good, so that we are working together with people of other faiths and no faith at all, strengthening everyone as a group and working together on a shared vision, shared goals, shared dreaming and imagining for a better, safer and fairer future for everyone in our community. Back to you, John.
Yeah, I think if I can just add to that, those ethnic groups, particularly ethnic religious groups in Western Sydney, were always thought to be very conservative, and they would vote conservative because they're worried about, you know, sort of the so-called moral issues, that sort of thing. Climate change was never on their agenda, but actually that was totally wrong, because come from the Pacific, climate change is your number one issue. Come from South Asia, climate change is a huge issue. So as a matter, this organising allows those issues to bubble to the surface and become what people act on, rather than those more traditional, socially conservative things that you know, we try and pigeonhole these groups into. So a very, very effective project, that one, and one that I think as a church has a lot of similarities to the way, you know, we might want to go about bringing change, building community, finding things in common, helping the powerless have power. Wonderful. That's our presentation. Happy to take whatever questions or listen to whatever discussion there might be.
Thank you very much. I love the sense of empowering other people. And let me just share one story, and then I'll open it up for others to make comments or have questions. We are currently involved in organizing with some of our neighbors to try and stop Energy Australia, a Chinese-owned energy company, from destroying a mountain and a lake in our area. And win or lose, just getting together with our neighbors and working on this issue. And Mary and I have been involved in activism, social activism, political activism over the years. None of our neighbors have. These are mostly people that have grown up in this area their whole life. This is brand new to them, but they're looking at what Energy Australia is proposing and saying, we don't want a bar of this, and we're going to do something about it. We're working with trying to get the Lithgow Council to come on board against this project, but we have a mayor who says, as long as other countries want our coal, we should be digging it and selling it to them. So that's the kind of political situation we're working with. But we have a hearing coming up before the council trying to stop Energy Australia from drilling on Mount Walker. And we have purchased 9 copies of this book for the 9 councillors on the Lithgow Council. And part of what we're going to be saying to them is there is another way than just digging up coal, and you can have jobs other than just in coal mining. And in this area, that is heresy. Because just about everybody we know is connected to coal in some way. So it's going to be a big switch in thinking for people in this area as well. But I'm very impressed with this book, and I recommend it. And we'll see how we go with the Lithgow Council on that. I'll open it up to others for comments and questions. Thank you very much, John. Sue, very good presentation. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah.
And can you just say, just tell us who you are and where you're coming from or talking from.
So it's Matt Stone. I live in Western Sydney.
Thank you.
I understand your question now, Sue, about whether I'd had any connection with the Sydney Alliance. I was actually involved in the AGL action, but with one of the other groups that John mentioned in his talk. I won't say which one while the record button's still on. But I was involved with, have been involved in some actions trying to get exactly the result we've had from the start of this year. Actually, I think it started early. I think it started later into last year when I became involved. And so when the news came through the other night, I was just thrilled. And the people I was working with, we were just over the moon saying, wow, you really can make a difference.
Fantastic.
With the Goliaths in our life. And it was just I mean, it helps to get a billionaire on side, but you got to, take the wins you get.
That's right. It wasn't just that. It was
I know. It wasn't just so. Yeah. It was great to be part of that, even in just a small way. And we have another action that we've also started working on, which is there's a off the western coast of Australia, there is an oil pipeline being planned there, which by BHP and Woodside, which we're also raising some questions about because of the ecological impact, the potential impact of this. And is it really the time we want to be starting new offshore gas pipelines and all of that when we should be transitioning away from fossil fuels? And as you rightly mentioned, this price spike we're having with gas and everything now, if we'd taken action 10 years ago, we probably wouldn't be suffering quite so much now. So I think you made a very, very good point there. So I might have to chat to you guys further about the whole Sydney Alliance thing.
Very happy to do that, Matt.
Yeah.
Thank you, Matt. Somebody else?
So just while you think of your question, I'll just respond to Mark's comment. So Energy Australia run the Mount Piper power station just near Lithgow. They've so the Wallerawang power station next door is closed. Mount Piper one is still open. It's a company which I have a small investment in, has a way of making building bricks out of fly ash from power stations. They've got a pilot plant at Mount Piper, and I think Energy Australia is going to build a larger scale plant there. It'll take all the crap that's come out of the really poisonous crap that's come out of that power station and make, using a carbon negative process, make building bricks that are way much less than concrete. So it's a concrete replacement that will be manufactured there in Lithgow, next to Lithgow, creating jobs and getting rid of some of the crap that's polluting the ground near you. So I think the council's already given approval, so it may not be in the advocacy there for you, Mark. But again, it's another wonderful example of how there are solutions there and they're happening.
Go ahead, Mary.
I read something recently about the fact that the trace minerals that are in the tailings after the coal mining, that if they would remine that, we could have the trace minerals for things like solar panels and other things that we need, instead of just letting it pollute the heavy metals into our water system and that sort of thing. But I like the idea too that you have, or that is being done now with the bricks.
Yeah, my guess is there'll be lots of technologies to get rid of it, because it's horrible stuff. It's it causes sickness and deaths.
Yeah, one of the things that we've discovered in fighting this particular project that they're proposing behind us, because it's literally right next to our property, is you have to watch out for greenwashing with these big companies.
Yeah.
Because while Energy Australia may be doing something very good there in, Wallerawang with creating bricks and that type of thing. On the other hand, they can be doing something very destructive. And the project that they're talking about back here is going to be based on coal-fired power, and yet they're calling it green. So it's with any of these projects, I think we really have to hold these energy companies and other big companies their feet to the fire, and really find out, is it green, is it renewable? And the other, just one more comment on the project that we're involved in. One of the things that Mary and I have been saying through this whole thing is, win or lose on this project, it has been worth the effort, because we've gotten to know our neighbors in a way that we would never have gotten to know them otherwise. And it has been excellent at building a sense of really community here, where so often, we just drive past, we might wave, but we're really getting to know our neighbors through this effort. So that in itself, I think, is a value.
Yeah, we got involved in the campaign of our local independent candidate who didn't win, but created an extraordinary community of people who found each other. And people are saying, I never knew anyone thought like me in this place. Now I found my family, I found my tribe. And that was a really beautiful thing that came out of it, even though we lost.
Austin, you look
One
like
question.
you want to say something.
Yeah, I would have just one query. Is Sydney Alliance and this group has any links with Greenpeace, or Greens are separate, or you competing with them, or are you supporting them during the election? How does it work?
There's probably a few questions in that. So Sydney Alliance, it's an alliance of a lot of small community groups as well as larger unions and churches and things. It doesn't have Greenpeace as a member, but it doesn't have any of the large environmental organisations as members, because it's very much sort of a geographical place thing going. So it's a very local Sydney-based alliance of groups, whereas Greenpeace is an international organisation. So there's not, so they're not a lot. They're not working together, but that's because they're not designed to be. It picks up, and I think definitely one of the appeals. So there would be people who would support Greenpeace who are part of groups who are part of Sydney Alliance, but Sydney Alliance has definitely pitched much wider to collect a lot more people than what Greenpeace would appeal to, because in addition to doing things on, say, climate change and energy prices, they also work for other stuff which people are interested in, which isn't necessarily seen as the needs of Greenpeace. And you talked about green groups. I don't know if you're referring specific to the election, but I will cover that when I was talking particularly about the community independents the first time around, who challenged the two-party system. Obviously, the Greens Party in Australia has been challenging the two-party system for nigh on 30 years and making small incremental certain amounts, but they hit a ceiling a while ago and haven't seemed to be able to push through that ceiling of votes. What's really different this election is that these community independents appealed to a different sector of voters that would normally vote Greens. We didn't see that the Greens vote went down in this election. It actually rose a little bit, but the votes that went to these community independents in those seats was massive swing for people going, yeah, you know what? And a lot of those votes came from people who in the past, it's like, well, for whatever reason, they were never going to vote for a Labor Party or a Greens Party. They had to vote Conservative. And this time they were given an alternative, which they were able to seize. So in many ways, and neither of those things mean that the efforts of Greens parties here in Australia or around the world, or organisations like Greenpeace and other conservation foundations or activist groups, it doesn't mean that they need to be replaced or anything like that. But this is a way these organisations and efforts are a way of picking up the people who, for whatever reason, won't be involved in anything with green in the title, and giving them an opportunity to act on climate, shift their money and things like that.
Yes,
I think one of the important things about the Teals is that because a lot of they're appealing to more conservative voters, I think it's important for us to see conservation is an issue that should cross party lines, and that we need to depoliticise it ultimately, and have it as something that everybody supports, whether Labor or Liberal.
Absolutely. And conservation is actually a very conservative thing to do. It's only reckless risk takers that want to, I don't know, set fire to the planet and send us spinning into a fiery planet heated grave. That's a really radical thing to do. The conservative thing to do is to keep what we've got, you know, preserve the status quo of below 350 parts per million, or I don't know, a safe climate or a livable temperature or something. That's an incredibly conservative thing to do. And in Australia, we often haven't realised how much climate, how much conservation, everything has been politicised. Not long ago, I met somebody from South Africa, and she said, I just don't understand this Australian thing. You know, in South Africa, we've got all sorts of political troubles. We've got a whole lot of troubles with violence and stuff like that. She said, but we're all, one thing all South Africans agree on, so we're really proud of our environment, and we're really proud of conserving what we have of our natural environment. Now, okay, probably at a ground level, that doesn't always work out in reality quite so well, but it's environment, climate has been politicised here to a degree which we don't see in, I don't know, other countries who don't have a Murdoch media, let's say. And that's about it. That really does stand up to scrutiny. So yeah, good point, Matt. Yes, Bruce.
Just by way of little information, and I'm not technically qualified to give this because I've only learned it over the dinner table, but my son-in-law is involved in a small company, and it's Australian technology, and they have devised a way of creating lime out of limestone, out of rock, with extreme low carbon output. It's and Boral is the big cement maker. Apparently, lime is a big factor in cement, and it's a very inefficient. Yeah, it makes a lot of carbon, sends a lot of carbon in the air.
Yep.
And this particular process eliminates something like 80% of the carbon in the process. So, and it's small Australian company. So they're building Boral is building a plant. They've got a Commonwealth government grant from the Liberal government, but the Labor said they will honour it. They've built plants in Europe, in America, and even in Russia, but the Russian business has died off, of course, recently. But it's a little bit of hope that here's a process that actually works, and they're starting to build plants and you know make building products a little bit more environmental.
Humans are incredibly creative. We have the creative ability and the imagination as endowed upon us by a God of creation. But often we still live under people who we like to believe that we are always being governed fairly, and the intelligent people are making the decisions, and they make good policy based on good evidence and stuff like that. But unfortunately, the truth is that there are always vested interests, and the things which are right and good and great for people and great for the planet have very sadly over the last couple of 100 years been frequently blocked, downgraded and prevented by vested interests. And it is really encouraging when things like that manage to poke through, and very grievous, as Matt said before. Where would we be if we'd done more renewables 10 years ago? That so much suffering, so much loss of opportunity and increasing of warming is not because there was no alternative, but because the alternative was blocked, suppressed, killed, not talked about. and at the same time, our money, taxpayers' money, going hand over fist at whatever horrendous minutely rate it is, you know, like $100,000 a minute or something. John can get the right figures for me, but it's just mind-blowing, directly to fossil fuel companies to keep them afloat. Yay. That's what, you know, when power is misused, that's what happens.
Yeah, I think what Bruce's example shows is that change will come quickly, because there'll be lots of examples we could point to where there's technology just waiting, it will explode. So I can't predict when, but you know, it'll happen quickly when it comes. So
Yeah, our problem is not a technological one, it's a political one.
yeah.
Well, back in the 70s, we were at the University of Delaware, and a friend of ours was working at batteries, and a big company came in, bought it up, shut down the research. It was like, you know, it was an
Story of electric cars, Mary.
Yep, it was
We had them in the
ridiculous.
1920s.
Yep,
That's right.
Doug Hine, go ahead.
Yeah. I think one of the striking things about the election in terms of both the community independence and the Greens campaign in Brisbane was the fact that the major two political parties have largely become hollowed out and just become institutions from which people feel disconnected. And that those two initiatives both involved basically people getting engaged and taking ownership. One of the stories I heard about the Greens campaign in Brisbane is that when the floods hit, they ceased the campaigning and got involved in helping their community with the recovery. They were there before the council was. Now, I think that that's an important example, because the political parties have got similar problem, the two parties to the churches. They've become institutions which seem interested in their own survival and disconnected from people's lives. And I think that there's a question, as I actually read about both campaigns, about what that has to say to us in the churches about the forms of church life and how we engage with the wider community. They're a question for us.
Yeah, I think so. And all these people, tens of thousands of people who turned out to do something really new and make it up as they go along as well in these electorates across the country. Why did they do that? What is it that, you know, they felt compelled to do that? What were they getting out of it? What was the story? Why did they chip in and do stuff with a whole bunch of strangers and work towards a common goal? They're great questions.
Yeah, I think big lessons for the church.
Now, Emma and Steve, aren't you from the Northern Beaches?
No, we're from southern Queensland.
Okay,
yeah.
Sorry, my mistake.
Yeah, we're actually a very conservative electorate. I'm listening with great interest to, you know, the
which electorate are you in?
Maranoa, which is also a coal area, the Galilee Basin. So listening with great interest to Mark and Mary and their efforts in and around Lithgow. Yeah, quite encouraging.
Bruce, go ahead.
Just the discussion. I worked in drug and alcohol education for many years. That's recreational drugs, and we also included tobacco, the quit smoking campaigns way back in the 80s and 90s, and what the mining companies are doing now is exactly what the tobacco companies were doing back then. They knew their product was killing people and injuring people's health, but they held off as long as they could to earn as much money and prolong their profit. And I think we've obviously got that same issue with the energy companies. And it took 30 years for the community to all agree that smoking was bad for us. And probably 30 years is the average amount when you start smoking. If you chain smoke for 30 years, the average it kills you just about in 30 years. But it took campaign after campaign, lots of money in advertising to actually bring the community round. So let's hope that we convince the community a lot quicker, because this is a much bigger problem again.
Yeah.
You're correct in saying there's a lot of similarities there, and certainly what the fossil fuel companies is doing is taking a leaf out of the tobacco playbook. A couple of differences is we're on a different time trajectory at the moment. So as you say, it's a hell of a lot more urgent. And another difference is that there was a bit of a building kind of thing with there were medical professionals in the community saying, hey, perhaps we shouldn't all be smoking so much, and then gradually building up with the government, getting more government support. And as you say, the advertising, shifting that social license of people, smoking being not so acceptable, did take governments getting on board and putting money into staff and quit smoking campaigns and public advertising, as well as rules around not being able to advertise at the sport anymore or in magazines or something like that. And with fossil fuels, we've been working against governments who are firmly in the pockets of the fossil fuel companies to an extent that they never were with the tobacco companies. So it's a bigger battle. There's a lot of money at stake. Not that there wasn't a lot with tobacco, but yeah, like we're only just starting to get the governments turning a little tiny bit now. And, it's great to see some of the words coming out of Labor, but they're going to have their feet held to the fire to get real action.
Actually, if I could add to that, one similarity which I stumbled across in the last year or so, I was doing some research on some of the think tanks, political think tanks around the place, and the coal companies use the same think tanks as the tobacco companies used to.
Yeah.
Not only that these think tanks, their primary donors are the coal companies and the tobacco companies, where they do release where their donors are, or where people have been able to find out who their donors are. It's basically the coal companies and the tobacco companies. So there's no wonder that there's echoes. They're actually quite tight in places.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Just a little bit of good news. Our street is blessed with a Ukrainian family staying, and a neighbour who we've known, for years, has been very much involved in arranging accommodation. She's arranged for at least three families of accommodation on the northern beaches. She's very much involved in taking the families over to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to get them sort of, part of their community, and they walk up and down our street and say hello, and they're learning English. So it's been a great blessing, and it's brought that horrible issue, but to our street, really. It's been good.
Good news. Well, I think a lot of what we heard today was good news, and I think we all need a bit of that. If we're used to listening to the normal news on radio and TV, we don't get a lot of good news, but I'm at least coming away with a sense of empowerment, and that we can get out and do something. So thank you again, John and Sue. Let me just say a prayer and send us on our way. So let's pray. God, who is creator of all that we have, you've created this big ship that we're all on. Help us to be aware of those issues around us where people are drilling holes in this ship, and help us not to stand back and be silent, but embolden us, empower us, get us out there joining with others to do something about your creation. Thank you for being with us and for your spirit that gives us that energy and that power to be involved in your creation. We pray all this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Goodbye,
Thank
everyone.
you
Thanks
for having
us.
us. Nice to
Yep.
see
See you
you.
all.